They handed her a ledger bound in debt and called it a marriage contract. What they didn't know was that she could read the numbers hidden between the lines far better than they could. You need to hear this story. According to official estate documents from the Northumberland County Archives, this arranged marriage was the beginning of an investigation that would expose a decades-long conspiracy and a secret that haunted one of England's most powerful aristocratic families. But before we get to the shocking discovery in the Duke's private study, you need to understand the tragic mystery surrounding his first wife's death. It changed everything. The air in the solicitor's office on Chancery Lane felt as thin and cold as the November day outside. Ilara Vance sat perfectly still, her hands folded in the lap of her plain, worsted wool dress, the only one she owned that wasn't frayed at the cuffs. At 20, she should have been contemplating her first London season. Instead, she was the primary asset in the liquidation of her family's honor. Across the mahogany desk, her father, Sir Reginald Vance, shifted his weight, his face a blotchy portrait of shame. The solicitor, Mr. Davies, cleared his throat. "The arrangement is quite clear, Miss Vance. His Grace the Duke of Blackwood has agreed to absorb all of Sir Reginald's outstanding debts. In exchange for this generosity, you will become his wife, the Duke of Blackwood." Alistair Beaumont, a man twice her age, a recluse who hadn't been seen in London society for nearly a decade, ever since the tragic death of his first wife. The gossip columns had feasted on it: a fall from a balcony at Blackwood Manor, the sprawling Gothic estate in the wilds of Northumberland. Some whispered it was an accident, others a suicide born of deep melancholy. "This is not a negotiation, Ilara," her father mumbled, unable to meet her gaze. "It is a matter of honor. The Duke saved my life years ago. I owe him a debt that can never be truly repaid. This is the least we can do." Ilara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had spent the last 3 years watching her father's fortunes crumble, meticulously tracking his disastrous investments in a private ledger, a skill she'd learned from a retired clerk her father had once employed. She understood debts, but this was an equation she couldn't balance. According to Dr. Judith Albright, a historian specializing in 19th century social contracts, these debts of honor were often used as leverage in marital arrangements, binding families in ways that financial contracts alone could not. Ilara later described the moment in a letter to her only confidant, a former governess. "I felt as though I was being traded, a line item in a ledger transferring from one man's account to another. My value was precisely the sum of my father's folly." What would you do in that situation? Really think about it. Your choice is between family ruin and a lifetime bound to a stranger haunted by ghosts. The wedding, which took place a week later on November 15th, 1848, was a stark, private affair at St. Giles in the Fields. There were no flowers, no guests beyond her father and the Duke's solicitor. The Duke himself was a tall, imposing figure, with silver threading his dark hair and eyes the color of a winter storm. He moved with a heavy stillness, as if the air around him was thicker, weighted by sorrow. When he spoke his vows, his voice was a low baritone, devoid of any emotion. He placed a simple gold band on her finger, his touch brief and cold. There was no wedding breakfast, no celebration. She was simply escorted to a carriage and driven north, away from everything she had ever known. You need to understand, this was not just a marriage, it was a banishment. Blackwood Manor rose from the Northumberland landscape like a jagged tooth of granite, shrouded in mist. It was a place of imposing towers and shadowed archways, where the wind cried around the stone battlements. Inside, the great hall was cavernous and cold, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and something else: neglect. A severe, rail-thin housekeeper named Mrs. Gable met them at the door. Her eyes, small and dark, assessed Ilara with undisguised disapproval. "Your Grace," she said, dipping into a curtsy for the Duke, ignoring Ilara completely. "Mrs. Gable, this is the Duchess," Alistair said, his tone flat. "See to her needs. Her chambers are in the East Wing." The East Wing, as Ilara would soon discover from the estate's original floor plans, preserved in the Manor Library, the East Wing was as far as one could get from the Duke's own apartments in the West Tower. He was installing her like a piece of furniture he had no intention of using. He then turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You will find everything you require. We will dine separately. If you need anything, inform Mrs. Gable." He bowed stiffly and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the flagstones until they disappeared. The loneliness of those first weeks was a physical presence. Ilara was a ghost in a haunted house, drifting through rooms filled with furniture draped in white cloths. The staff, loyal to the memory of the first Duchess, treated her with a frigid courtesy that was worse than outright hostility. Pay attention to this detail. This isolation becomes crucial to what she discovers next. Deprived of human connection, Ilara turned to what she knew: numbers. She requested the household account books from a reluctant Mrs. Gable, claiming a desire to understand her new responsibilities. The ledgers, dated from the past 5 years, were a mess of inconsistent entries and vague expenditures. But what she didn't know was that the real scandal was just beginning. One afternoon, seeking refuge in the vast, dusty library, she found a hidden alcove behind a row of theological texts. There she discovered a set of older ledgers, bound in dark green leather. These were the household accounts from before the first Duchess's death. Ilara's breath caught. They were immaculate. The handwriting was elegant, the columns perfectly balanced, the notes in the margins sharp and insightful. The final entry was dated October 3rd, 1838, the day before Lady Annalise Beaumont died. Estate documents from the period show that large, remote manors like Blackwood were highly susceptible to financial mismanagement, especially following a family tragedy, notes Dr. Alistair Finch, an expert on aristocratic estate law. Grief provided the perfect cover for malfeasance. Ilara spread the old ledger next to the new one. The difference was staggering. Expenditures for the same items, wine, linens, repairs, had nearly doubled in the years since Annalise's death. Historical records from the Bank of England show that inflation during that decade was less than 2%, making the discrepancies statistically impossible to justify. Stay with me. What she found next will shock you. In the margins of the final page of Annalise's ledger, tucked beside a tally of servant wages, was a small, almost invisible notation: final payment to F. Finch Re, the London matter. Finch. The name meant nothing to her, but it was a loose thread, and Ilara felt an overwhelming compulsion to pull it. For weeks, she dedicated herself to her secret audit. During the day, she maintained the facade of the quiet, compliant Duchess. At night, by candlelight, she cross-referenced invoices, shipping manifests, and bank drafts she requested from the estate office under the pretense of organizing old records. What she uncovered was a pattern, a slow, systematic bleed. Funds were being diverted through a holding company in London she'd never heard of, Finch and Sons Imports. Then something unexpected happened. A letter arrived, postmarked from London. It was for the Duke, but Mrs. Gable left it on a hall table where Ilara saw the sender's name on the wax seal, a stylized F. Later that evening, she heard raised voices coming from the Duke's study, a rare occurrence in the silent manor. She crept closer, hiding in the shush. The silence that fell upon the dining room was not empty. It was a dense, suffocating thing, heavy with the weight of a decade's worth of lies. Alistair's hand, which had shot out to intercept Finch's lunge, remained clamped on his cousin's wrist. It was not the grip of a nobleman, but that of a blacksmith, white-knuckled and unyielding. Finch froze, his handsome face contorted into a mask of disbelief and panic. His eyes locked on the small leather-bound diary, as if it were a loaded pistol aimed at his heart. Alistair did not look at him. His gaze was fixed on the book. With his free hand, he slowly, deliberately picked it up. The room was so still, Ilara could hear the faint whisper of the page turning, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. He found the final entry. His shoulders, which had been perpetually bowed by the weight of grief, seemed to hollow further, as if an internal support had finally crumbled to dust. A sound, low and guttural, tore from his throat, not of rage, but of a profound, bottomless agony. It was the sound of a man seeing the ghost he had lived with for 10 years and realizing, for the first time, that it had been murdered. "He says this will be the end of it, but I know he is lying," Alistair read aloud, his voice a raw, broken whisper that still managed to fill every corner of the vast room. "He has taken everything. There is nothing left. I see no way out but the balcony." He closed his eyes, the diary held in a trembling hand. My God, Annalise! It's a forgery, Finch hissed, struggling against Alistair's grip. A hysterical woman's scribblings. You can't possibly believe this. This child! He shot a venomous glare at Ilara. Ilara did not flinch. She met his gaze, her own clear and cold as winter ice. The fear that had lived in her heart since arriving at Blackwood Manor was gone, calcified into something harder, something stronger. The Duchess's words are her own, Mr. Finch, she said, her voice perfectly level. But the numbers are mine. She reached into the pocket of her dress again, not for a diary, but for a folded sheaf of papers. She laid them beside the book. These are copies of the invoices from your company, Finch & Sons, for imported silks and furniture over the last 3 years. And these, she added, placing a second set beside them, are the corresponding entries from the estate ledger you so helpfully provided for my perusal. The invoices charge the estate £150 for a bolt of lion silk. The ledger records an expenditure of £400. The difference across hundreds of transactions amounts to a sum that could have funded a hospital wing. Alistair finally turned his head, his eyes no longer clouded with sorrow but blazing with a terrifying clarity, settling on his cousin. The railway shares, he said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible, lethal softness. The diminishing returns you blamed on market fluctuation. You were selling our shares and pocketing the principal, weren't you? Reporting only the falsified, reduced dividends. Finch stopped struggling. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, sallow pallor. The charm, the easy confidence, the patronizing smile. It all dissolved, revealing the craven, grasping thing that had been hiding underneath. He was no longer a charismatic man of finance. He was a common thief caught with his hand in the till. Alistair, for the love of God, think of the family name. The scandal, he stammered, his voice losing its polished cadence. We can handle this quietly. No one need know. You invoked my wife's name to cover your extortion, Alistair said, the words precise and chilling. You used my grief as a smokescreen for your grand larceny. The time for quiet is over. He released Finch's wrist with a shove that sent him stumbling back into his chair. He did not shout or call the guards. The cold, brutal finality in his voice was more terrifying than any outburst. You will go to your room. You will not leave it. The solicitor will be here at dawn. You will explain yourself to him, and then you will answer to the law. My family's name will survive the truth. I doubt very much that yours will. The hours that followed were a blur of cold resolve. There was no sleep. As the house settled into a stunned silence, the servants whispering behind closed doors, Alistair led Ilara not to their separate chambers, but to the one room she had never been permitted to enter, his study. The door, which had always been a symbol of his exclusion and his private pain, he now held open for her. The room was a mausoleum. Annalise's portrait hung over the cold hearth, her painted eyes seeming to hold a deep, perpetual sadness. The air was stale with the scent of old paper, leather, and the ghosts of forgotten brandy. But Alistair did not hesitate. He walked directly to the massive oak desk, the epicenter of his self-imposed exile, and gestured for her to sit in his own chair. He remained standing, a sentinel in his own home, as he began pulling out ledgers, letters, and account books, some of them coated in a fine layer of dust. He told me he had consolidated everything for ease of management, Alistair said, his voice hollow. He called it modernizing the estate. He was hiding his tracks. For the rest of the night they worked. A strange, focused intimacy grew between them in the flickering candlelight. It was not romantic. It was the bond of two soldiers in a trench, united against a common enemy. Her quick, methodical mind, trained by a father who believed a daughter's intellect was as valuable as a son's, found patterns he had missed. She cross-referenced Finch's personal correspondence with the estate's financial outflows, uncovering a web of shell companies and false creditors. He in turn provided the context, explaining the history of each tenancy, the value of each piece of land, his knowledge filling in the gaps of her analysis. They discovered the true, staggering scale of the betrayal. Finch had not just been skimming profits. He had been systematically liquidating assets. Parcels of land sold to mysterious conglomerates that traced back to him. Ancient woodlands, held by the family for centuries, stripped of their timber. He had been hollowing out the duchy from the inside, leaving a beautiful, gilded shell that was on the verge of collapsing. At one point, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the tall windows, Alistair paused, his hand resting on a ledger. He was staring at the portrait of Annalise. "I let this happen," he murmured, the confession raw and unguarded. "I wrapped myself in my mourning like a shroud and let the world outside my door burn. I saw her sadness, but I thought it was a mirror of my own. I never asked." Ilara looked up from her papers, her eyes weary but clear. "You were grieving. He exploited that. It was a monstrous abuse of power and of your trust. The fault is his, Alistair, not yours." It was the first time she had used his given name. It felt natural, right? In the shared crucible of that long night, the Duke and the bartered bride had been burned away, leaving only Alistair and Ilara. The arrival of Mr. Davies, the family solicitor, was a quiet, solemn affair. An elderly man with eyes that had seen the best and worst of human nature, he listened without interruption as Ilara, with Alistair's quiet affirmations, laid out their findings. He examined the diary, the invoices, and the ledgers, his expression growing more grim with each page. When they were finished, he simply nodded. "The evidence is irrefutable," he stated, his voice dry as parchment. "This is not merely a breach of trust, Your Grace. This is a matter for the Crown Court. We will begin proceedings to freeze his assets and recover what we can. It will be a long and difficult process." Finch was removed from the house not in chains, but with the quiet, devastating finality of legal ruin. He left without a word, his handsome face a ruin of fear and hatred, a man utterly and completely broken by a truth he had thought long buried. After he was gone, a new kind of silence descended upon Blackwood Manor. It was not the heavy silence of unspoken grief, but the clean, empty silence of a room that has been aired out after a long illness. The house was waiting to breathe again. That evening, they did not dine in the formal hall. They took a simple meal on a small table in the library, surrounded by the comforting presence of books. For a long time they ate without speaking, but the silence was companionable. Finally, Alistair put down his fork and looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady. "More than one. I treated you as a solution to a problem, a piece in a transaction. I saw you as a means to secure my family's name, and I never once considered the woman I was binding to it. I underestimated you, Ilara, and I am profoundly sorry." "You did what you believed was necessary," she replied softly, "and I did the same." "You did more," he insisted. "You sought justice when I had resigned myself to sorrow. You brought light into a house that had been dark for a decade. You saved more than the estate. I believe you saved me from myself." He paused, searching for the right words. "Our marriage was a contract, a foundation laid in desperation. I would like, if you would allow it, to build something new upon it. Something based not on duty, but on choice, on partnership, on respect." He reached across the small table, his hand covering hers. It was a simple gesture, yet it held more warmth and sincere connection than any of the formal rituals of their wedding. "I want to know my wife," he said, "if she will let me." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow or fear, but of a quiet, overwhelming relief. It was the release of a tension she hadn't even known she was carrying. She had come to Blackwood prepared to survive, to endure. She had never dared to hope she might find a place to belong, to be seen. "I think," she said, her voice thick with emotion, as she turned her hand over to clasp his, "that I would like to know my husband." Their new beginning was not a fairy tale. It was a quiet, painstaking reconstruction, much like the restoration of the estate itself. The legal battle to reclaim what Finch had stolen took years, a public testament to the consequences of his wrongful acts. But through it all, Alistair and Ilara worked as one. They became a familiar sight, heads bent together over maps and ledgers, their debates in the study often lasting late into the night, their shared purpose forging a bond stronger than any vow. He discovered the fierce intellect and wry humor that lay beneath her composed exterior. She discovered the deep well of compassion and the unwavering sense of justice he had buried beneath his grief. They began to walk the gardens together in the evenings, and the sound of their quiet conversation, and sometimes even laughter, began to fill the long, stagnant halls of the manor. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year later, As they stood on a hill overlooking the estate's rolling fields, he turned to her. He held no ring, no grand token. He offered only the simple, profound truth of their journey. "Everything you see," he said, his gesture encompassing the ancient woods and tenant farms, "we saved together. You are as much a part of this land as I am. You are its Duchess, not by contract, but by merit." This was the true foundation of their legacy. Their personal restoration became a blueprint for the entire duchy. They transformed Blackwood from a place of secrets into a bastion of progress, their joint efforts defined by responsible governance and an unwavering commitment to sustainable stewardship of the land. They established a far-reaching scholarship fund, championing education access and youth literacy for every child on their lands. Believing that healing began with security, their focus on financial transparency and strict policy compliance rebuilt community trust. This philanthropic legacy was not one of mere charity, but of deep investment in family wellness and local craftsmanship, ensuring the tenants thrived. They honored the past through meticulous historical preservation, but their true work was in creating a safe community, ensuring the shadows of deceit were forever banished by a future built on shared integrity and a profound dedication to public service.